Welcome to our second talk of the Sunday Salon series of 2021. I'm so sorry I can't welcome you in person. I'm Lisa Fox Martin, the chair of the Board of Trustees. And if you missed our first talk in January, which was absolutely wonderful, you can watch it on thomascole.org under education, salons, and it was just a marvelous talk. So I do advise you to catch up on that if you missed it. We have the great pleasure of having a wonderful speaker today. And now please welcome Betsy Jacks, our executive director, who will introduce her to us. Thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully we will see you again next month at our next salon. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. And thanks for coming to the 2021 Sunday Salons. It's a snowy afternoon here in the Hudson Valley, but luckily that can't stop us. And I'm pleased to say we have about twice as many people signed up as could have fit into the new studio where we would have held the program in person. So I'm so glad that so many people can hear this important talk today. We are absolutely thrilled to have Elon Cook Lee with us. She's in high demand. Her talk is entitled Repair Work, Centering Black Humanity at Historic Sites. And she has trained hundreds of historic site interpreters, museum professionals across the country on interpretation theory, interpreting the history and legacy of slavery, and how to incorporate anti-oppression frameworks into all aspects of museum work, which is one of the most central issues that we all face in the museum field. So I'd like to start today by giving you a little bit of the research that we've been doing at the Thomas Cole site. We started really back in 2004 when Bob Toole did our cultural landscape report, which is a huge research report about the site's history, and followed that in 2009 with another commissioned large report called Life at Cedar Grove by Maureen Hennessy. And since then, we've been undertaking research every year. Sylvia Hassenkoff has helped us quite a lot. And our Thomas Cole Fellows are pursuing this project that we are currently calling Full House, and I'll show you why. So this is a quote by Thomas Cole's wife, Mariah. Oh, sorry, let me go back. And try that again. All right, let's see if you see that. Seems to be going there. Technology. There we go. So Mariah Cole in 1842 said, "The house is not half large enough for us." And we had been presenting the voice of Thomas Cole in the Thomas Cole House, but there were a lot of other voices present. Here is just the family tree of Mariah, who was part of what we call the Thompson family tree because her uncles, John Thompson and Thomas Thompson, built the Thomas Cole House. And Mariah, with her sisters, lived there full time. And then all of these other people were coming and going, some of them like Charlotte, longtime residents. And so that was just one side of the family. So that incorporates quite a few people in what is really a 3-bedroom house. Next is Thomas Cole's arrival, and he married Mariah in 1836. And as you can see, he comes with a very large extended family as well. He was facing a lot of financial pressures because he was supporting not only his own parents, but his sisters, Sarah, Anne, and Mary, and their children, and then, of course, his own children. But that's not all. In addition to the family members, there were a lot of people working there. And through the census records, as well as letters and journals and other records, we found a lot of other references to people who were there. We intend to delve more deeply this year to find out more about the free Black woman who was there, according to the 1840 census. And in letters such as this one from Mariah to Thomas, "I must introduce you to Peter, as he is one of our household. He is a very civil Dane. was destitute and could not find work, so Uncle Sandy took him in. So they're wonderful accounts that give a real sense of the complexity, the diversity, and the full amount of support that Thomas Cole was benefiting from in this household. So he could not have really created those artworks on his own. So we intend to create a fuller picture of what was going on there. This is a list of all the people that were either full-time residents or long-time residents just during Thomas Cole's residence at the Thomas Cole House from 36 to 48. So as you can see, it was a very busy place, and there's lots of interesting stories there that we are looking forward to uncovering. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Elon Cook Lee. She is the Director of Interpretation and Education at the National Trust for Historic Preservation and organized the Sites of Enslavement Working Group there. Before coming to the National Trust, she received her master's degree in Public Humanities and the Fellowship for the Study of Public History of Slavery at Brown University. She taught undergraduate courses that covered race and the institution of slavery, public history, restituting stolen art, repair work, and racial reconciliation at the Rhode Island School of Design. So she is thoroughly versed in this subject and has been helping sites like ours all across the country. We're so looking forward to what she has to say today. So please welcome Elon.
Thank you, everyone. I am so excited to be here today. There's a lot of interesting stuff that I'm happy to share with you. I also hope that you all are enjoying this beautiful Sunday. I know we have snow here in Maryland where I live, and I'm so excited to get out there and play in it. I know in New York, maybe you guys are tired of it, but you can feel free to send more down here. We don't have to go anywhere, so pile it on. That's all I say. So I'm so thankful that this wonderful team at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site asked if I could speak today about the work that I do at historic house museums. More specifically, they asked if I can talk about the practice of centering Black humanity in historic spaces where our Africans and their descendants lived and worked. And this is the work that I am most passionate about. I'm gonna put my PowerPoint up on the screen for you all to see. There we go. Let's just hold on one second. Let me just make sure I've got my notes together. Well, this is one of the fun things about doing our presentations online. Sometimes you move things all around on your screen. Okay, so I'm excited to talk to you all about the work of repair work and how to center Black humanity at historic houses. So here's a little bit of the work that I've been doing all around the country. I've been a tour guide, leading tours, especially on the history of slavery. I have done work in historical costuming and clothes. I've also done a little bit of what I like to think of as cosplay. And on your left side, you might see me in an outfit dressed as a character from the movie Black Panther. And it's actually part of a project I was doing on restituting stolen objects that exist in different museums around the country. So this is an object that is at the Rizzi Museum in Providence, Rhode Island, that had been stolen from the Kingdom of Benin in the 1800s and now sits here. So a lot of the work that I do is looking at the work of repair through multiple different lenses. Now, whenever I am doing work with historic sites, I always ask them the question, or I always ask the staff, why are you doing this work? What drives you, especially in the times when, you know, sometimes the pay might be low, or you're having a hard time getting a new grant, or, you know, you can't quite figure out how to tell stories to the public that gets them excited about coming back. So why are you doing this work? And for me, I do this work for the past and the present. It's all about thinking about how would my ancestors, and here's Elizabeth, my great-great-grandmother on one side, how would my ancestors want their stories told? I also have a son recently in 2020, is a little pandemic baby. And I do a lot of my work for him and the children who he'll be classmates with one day. The challenge of doing work with historic sites is that very often, especially for kids of color, historic sites feel exclusionary. They feel exclusive. They feel like places where they might go and not hear about information that will be relevant to them. In some cases at historic sites, a child of color, especially a Black child, may go and learn information that's told in a way that makes them feel embarrassed about their families and their family history and their ancestry. Other times, you might have situations where a child might be humiliated by a staff member or by comments that are said by other visitors at the historic sites. So a lot of the work that I do is to make sure that when a child, especially, but really anyone goes to a historic site, that they can feel welcomed and comfortable, that they can feel like the information is relevant to their lives and to their experience, that they are learning something new about the individuals who lived in that house or about the architecture, about the gardens, but they're also learning something about local, national, or international history. There have been dozens of studies, especially in the last decade, about the impact of museums and historic sites on the general public. And we've recognized that, that historic sites are considered to be the best places for learning, especially fact-based learning, and are more respected by the general public than government sources and media and the news. So it's incredibly important that we are doing all of this work through a sense of justice for all the things that have gone wrong in the history of our country, so that we are able. Yes.
Your slides are not advancing on your PowerPoint, so I just wanted to see if maybe you should go to the alternate that you had with the PDF version.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you seeing the full slides, or are you seeing the speaker view?
We just see the home slide that says repair work at the top, and the PowerPoint is not advancing to the next slide.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. Let me see what I can do. Hold on one second, please. All right, you all may have to look at me for just a moment as I move these items around. Okay, and I'm gonna try one more time to do the screen share. Are you all able to see it now?
Well, I see the same view as before, which is your home slide.
Mm-hmm.
And your slide presentation. There are other slides on the left in a list. You can see if they advance now.
Oh, I'm so sorry about this.
I see the next slide now. It says historic preservation.
Well, everyone, I want you all to know that we did this in a rehearsal multiple times and it worked. So I am sorry that it's now doing it incorrectly. Okay, I will do my backup instead. Okay. All right, now we will try this one instead. Okay. Okay. All right, now can you all see the next slide?
Yeah, I think it's working now.
Okay, all right, that's fine. right, well, sorry about that. In my backup presentation, it doesn't have all my lovely photos of all the different projects I've worked on, but that's okay. So this is my my great-grandmother, Elizabeth, and my son, Simon, that I was talking about before. So, excuse me. So the reason why I love to ask people the question of, you know, why are you doing this, is there's always something that's really driving everyone in this work, no matter what else is going on. And so this is where I think of not just centering Blackness, but centering who each of us truly is in our work. That's how we really keep going. So I think I talked about the various studies that have gone on in the museums, making sure that this is where people come to for the most relevant, pertinent, and fact-based information. So this is why I talk about repair work. So now we've got the next slide. Okay. So repair work is recognizing all the challenges that have happened in our nation's history that may have broken us apart from each other, or broken us apart from certain institutions or organizations. So in the concept of repair work, this is all about learning to see what's been broken or damaged in our past, and then learning how to repair what's been damaged. The best way to do that learning is also to actually build a team. It's to build a team of collaborators to work with you, and making sure that this is a team that is diverse, not just racially, but also in gender and in life experience. And then begin the process of doing the work of repair. And then, just like with anything, any kind of process, you often have to do it again. So in the way that you might be repairing a roof, you recognize that once there's a massive storm that comes up, that newly repaired roof still might leak a little bit. So you will have to continuously do that repair, even with a brand new roof. So repairing institutions, repairing relationships between the public, especially people of color, with institutions is very much the same. So before I dig too much into the work of centering Black humanity at historic sites, I want you all to see the problem that has often come up in the history of historic preservation. So we're going to do a little historic preservation 101 here. So the practice of preserving homes and artifacts of individuals was individuals who were deemed important to American history and to patriotism in this country started with the saving of George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, from its ruin in 1858. So after Washington died, a series of his descendants took on the house, but didn't have the money and the wherewithal to keep it up in the standards that Washington had lived in. So if any of you are Downton Abbey fans, I know I just watched all 6 seasons last week. I can tell you that big houses are expensive to maintain, and they take not just money, but a singular vision and a collective effort to preserve them in perpetuity. Mount Vernon was saved by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the group you see here. They're a group that was started by and heavily funded by slave owners. They recreated Washington's home and plantation land as a monument and as a museum for our first president. It was meant to be a space for patriotic education. The effort to save and restore Washington's home and relics from his life was so successful that other similar ladies' associations formed across the country. These new preservation organizations chose to preserve the properties of individuals that they believed all Americans should revere and emulate. A movement was started, and the very first American history museums were established. And that's exciting, it's wonderful, right? But these sites were purchased and turned into spaces for educating the public. The historic preservation movement was started, as I said, by middle and upper class white and mostly slave-owning women at a time when only white people could be citizens of this country. The majority of Black people were still enslaved, and those who weren't couldn't vote or hold office other than a very small few. Our nation's anti-Black laws were reinforced by social practices in the North and the South and all the way west as far as our border went. And as slavery ended, the lynching era that led to the deaths of thousands of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous Americans began. It was a deeply unequal time, and that inequity was enshrined, often without a bad intent, in our nation's historic sites and museums. And also, it's impolite to talk ill of the dead. So historic homes made sure to preserve and educate the public about the positive aspects of an honored individual's life. After emancipation, tour guides of historic houses told stories about enslaved people that made the listener wistful for the good old plantation life, or downplayed Black history and the histories of other peoples of color at the site, or erased the histories of people of color from the interpretation altogether. This was often justified by the notion that people of color didn't contribute anything of note to the historic home, or by extension to American history in general. And it's not just historic houses. When you think back to the ways in which you learned history in school, especially anyone who was in school, earlier than the last 5-10 years, think about who were you taught about? Who were you taught to emulate and look up to in our nation's history? Whose stories were often left out? I'm a millennial. I was in elementary, middle, and high school in the 90s and the very early 2000s. And when I think about the Black history that I was taught, and I loved my history class, I loved my history teacher. But when I think about the history that I was taught, slavery was minimized to a thing that we only talked about at the end of the Civil War. It was as though it didn't start at the very beginning, or actually before the very beginning of our nation. So it's really all of our educational institutions, not just historic sites, but also in our schools, that we have this very deep issue with how we tell the stories about our past. When we center Black humanity, we ensure that everyone's hopes, dreams, problems, flaws, questions, and desires are seen equitably, that everyone gets to be a fully realized human. When we don't talk about the history of slavery, when we don't talk about African American history, when we don't talk about other histories of people of color, suddenly white Americans' histories become very small. So it's important for everyone to be learning all of this history, and it's important for all sites. Even if there's only one Black person in the town, it's important for there to be an understanding of how we talk about our history. So when it comes to centering Black humanity, there's a lot of aspects of doing this work. Doing it really, especially when we're doing it successfully and collaboratively with partners in the community, and getting a lot of feedback from people of color, especially. When we do this right, it helps us make sense of our world. It's not just getting a better understanding about our history, it's also about understanding our present world. We can understand the state, what happened at the nation's capital back at the beginning of January. We can understand the Black Lives Matter protests. We can understand why there are so many different challenges that go on in this country. So it's necessary for everyone to be doing this work. So when it comes to how do you center this Black humanity, it always starts with breaking down stereotypes and myths. And a lot of times that's work that we have to do within ourselves. We all grew up in a world, and that's whether you grew up in America or in another country, we all grew up in a world that's full of stereotypes and myths, especially about people who are part of groups that we don't belong to. So the first thing that's really important, that when we go back to that repair process, is learning. It's seeing what's wrong and then learning about how to fix it, learning more information. So some of this can include, especially when it comes to the context of historic sites, including historic sites in the North, is recognizing that even after slavery ends, when Black people are considered legally free in the United States, they still were not allowed to be equal. And that's because of our nation's laws and our social practices. So a lot of times when I work with historic houses, they get very excited to talk about, well, we had free Black people who lived and worked at this site. And that's exciting, and it's wonderful. But how are you telling those individual stories? it's important to make sure that you aren't trying to justify their any kind of mistreatment that occurs, and that you are telling their stories in ways that allows them to be intelligent decision-making individuals in the same way that you tell the stories about white individuals. It also comes up in a lot of my workshops with historic houses when people ask a question about, is so-and-so a good person? So in our example today with the Thomas Cole house, was Thomas Cole a good person? I really caution people to think carefully about what you do with the word good. Is anyone really good or bad? Or should we actually be thinking about good decisions or bad decisions? Good choices, bad choices. Everyone has a little bit of mix of both. So one of the questions that pops up a lot for me, since a lot of my work is with historic sites with histories of slavery, for instance, was George Washington a good slave owner? Is that actually the most appropriate question to be asking when we are talking to the public about the history of our site? Instead, it's important to be laying out the facts and the information about that individual's life and let the public decide for themselves. Another one is the concept of neutrality at historic houses. When we center the humanity of Black people, we recognize that historic sites cannot be neutral. Historic houses, just like I was talking about earlier in our little 101, were created by individuals who had biases and opinions. They made choices to make things the way they were. And over the generations since, choices were continually made to bring in more information about people of color, or to save that for some other time in the future. To dig into that research and use that information about Black people, even if it shines a negative light on the individual whose historic house you're working in. Even when we do that, this is important to doing the work of centering Black humanity. So it's all about really telling the truth, the full truth about people. And when we claim to be neutral, we actually mask the decision-making process that happens behind the scenes as though it's actually neutral, when it really isn't. So when it comes to making changes at historic houses, that's a lot of the work that I do. And the first thing I work on people to change is actually the language they use. A lot of the places that I work with, they ask the question of, do I say African American, Negro, Black? Do I use the N-word? So actually talking about the language is actually really key at the very beginning. Finding out what kinds of words are inappropriate to use. Recognizing that even if you're going to do an exhibition about an individual and they are using terms that maybe we think are inappropriate right now, what's the context in which those terms can be used appropriately and in an educational manner, and how can they be used in ways that often unintentionally is hurtful? So beyond the actually I have a little slide to share about that one as an example. Oh, I'm so sorry, that was in the other version. Okay, so it's not just using, what term to use for African American. It may also be, are we going to use the term slave or enslaved? So it's really important that if you're going to be centering the humanity of an individual, especially the Black humanity, that you use active language. So an enslaved person, that's active language. It's showing that this person was enslaved by someone, that it wasn't something that they wanted, that this was something that they were either born into this status or they were made to be enslaved. So this is an active process. So using slave or enslaved. And there's a whole list of other terms that can be used that are really important to changing the language at a historic site to make sure that we are centering the humanity of Black people and other people of color. There's also another thing that's important is the research that you're doing. A lot of the historic sites that I work with, their challenges, they don't know how to find the African American presence in their site or in their community. So they're trying to figure out, well, what kinds of documents do I need to look for? a lot of times the Black stories are actually hidden right in plain sight. They're in the diaries, they're in the letters, everything that Betsy was showing us at the very beginning of our session. So it's a lot of times it's making sure that you can actually see that information, recognizing that it's there. Now, you may have just, you know, the name of someone and one sentence about that person that represents their entire lifetime. So when you're doing the research, if you want to do a good job of doing a balanced presentation of that history, it's really important to find other people's narratives from that time period. So in my work with historic houses, especially Southern historic houses, talking about the history of slavery, I love to use the autobiography of Harriet Jacobs, which is a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So this is a book because this is a woman who lived during the era of slavery in the North and then escaped, in the South, and then actually escaped to the North and lived in places like New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts for many years while slavery continued. And she writes an autobiography of the years of her life before emancipation. And she has these absolutely incredible details about what it's like to be an enslaved woman and what it's like to be a free Black woman. So if I was working at the Thomas Cole House and I have a free Black woman who's living in New York and I'm looking for what would her experience be like? What kinds of interactions would she have had with the people of the outside world? I might turn to the example of Harriet Jacobs' autobiography, or many of the other slave narratives that were coming out of the time, along with many of the other accounts that were written either in first person or by others as primary and secondary sources that are available. And we use those sources to help fill in the gaps in a person's life. So you can take their name, the kind of work that they do, and you can build an entire life based on what the lives of other similar people would have been like. Another thing that's really key is to look at the storytelling. I think that's my next slide. There we go. So in telling Black stories, a lot of times historic houses, but not just historic houses and museums, but also novelists, journalists, and other writers, especially if they are not African American, but even I find this as an issue with African Americans, that it can be really difficult to write from a Black perspective. Now, when I was a professor I was an adjunct professor at the Rhode Island School of Design for 3 years, leading up to my move here to Maryland. And so I taught students, they were all Generation Z. So they are coming up in the 2000s with all kinds of information, with the internet, with teachers who are better trained. And yet, when I had them write stories or write biographies of enslaved people, they wrote the stories as though they were coming from the perspective of the slave owner. And that's my Black students, that's my Asian students, that's my white students, that's everyone had that challenge. And that's because throughout our lives, even our young people, throughout our lives, we are taught to see the world through the eyes of white Americans, especially elite white Americans. So when it comes to centering the Black experience, the first thing you have to do is you have to find the actual subject of the story. So on the left side of the screen, I have an example of exhibit text that I found at a historic house, where it was actually a historic house that was dedicated to the life of a printer. And he was married, he had several children, and he owned 3 enslaved people. So this is an example of the text that was originally in the exhibit in this man's historic house. Now, actually, first, this was part of the exhibit on slavery at the site. So this was the exhibit on the enslaved African-American individuals at the site. So it wasn't actually the exhibition specifically about John Thornton, the printer. This was actually supposed to be an exhibit about the enslaved people he owned. So on the left side, you can see it says, John Thornton was a successful printer in New York. 3 slaves worked in his print shop. One was a man named Tom who set the type. When you look at that paragraph, who's the subject? Especially who's the subject of that first sentence? It's John Thornton. In the second sentence, 3 slaves worked in his print shop. It's the 3 slaves. But is that the most appropriate terminology to be using about them? Is that how they would want to be described if they were to write a story about who they were? Maybe they would want to be called the enslaved people who worked at the print shop. Maybe they would want to be called enslaved printers. Maybe they would want to be called by their names. The last sentence, one was a man named Tom who set the type. So the subject here is Tom, but in the entire paragraph, the subject is still really quite focused on the slave owner and the perspective of someone on the outside, not Tom, not the other 3 enslaved people. On the right side, I have how it could be, this paragraph could be rewritten. Tom Cuffey was an enslaved printer in New York. He was owned by a man named John Thornton. Tom learned to read and write as a child, and this qualified him to serve as a typesetter in John's shop. So this fills in more information. If you are a typesetter, a key skill you need to have is literacy. You must be able to at least read in order to be able to put the letters in order to be able to figure out from the handwritten script of what's going to be on the page to the letters, the print letters that need to go in. So enslaved printers were literate. You don't see that in the first one. You see a man who maybe is just instructed, set the type. So when it comes to centering the Black humanity in a story, it's important to allow individuals to be intelligent, to make decisions, to have a life beyond the moment in which they are interacting with a white person. So I use this example because I have seen this many times in my work with historic houses, not just when it comes to enslaved history or Black history, but also at sites that have a Mexican American history, but the site is dedicated to a white individual who owns a property, or to a natural history museum that is talking about the Native American experience. So it's really not just about centering. When we are centering Black humanity, it's actually learning the process of centering the humanity of all people. So this is an example of how this works. So we talked about language, we talked about storytelling. It's also always important to fill in as much context for the situation. A lot of times when people come on my walking tours that I used to do, or to public programs about the history of race, they ask questions about not just the history, but what's going on right now. And so that's why it's so important to fill in as much information as possible. It's also important to make sure that we are always breaking down myths. A lot of times when we as visitors go to historic sites, there are myths about Black individuals or about Indigenous people. An example with Indigenous people might be that, such and such tribe was a warlike people. So that is a stereotype that we see in a lot of places, even now in 2021. And so it's incredibly important that we are seeing this misinformation and then doing the process of repairing what's happening, fixing and making the changes necessary to make sure that all visitors, that everyone, that all of us feel comfortable in a historic home and are excited to be there, and so excited to be there that we go home and talk about that experience with others. Now, many of you, I believe, live in New York. And so I'd love for, maybe in the chat box, if you all can think about what is a African-American historic house that you yourself have visited in the last couple of years. And if you can put the name of that house in our chat. Monticello. Lewis Latimer House, that's a favorite. Harriet Tubman. Louis Armstrong's house, I just found out about that last night. I'm so excited. I can't wait to go. As soon as this pandemic is over, I'm going to be there. Weeksville, another excellent, the Frederick Douglass House, and Spencer House, yes. So there's so many great ones in there. So when you are thinking about what are some great examples of how to center Black life, a lot of times we think of Black historic houses. Frederick Douglass Historic House, I've been there like 5-6 times. I'm from Maryland, so me and Frederick Douglass were like this, right? I like to think I have his hair, right? So when you go to a house like Frederick Douglass House, it's all centered around him. But the wonderful thing about Frederick Douglass House is it's not just only about him. It also talks about his wives, his children, the people he interacted with, and it's all done in a way that fleshes out who they were as individuals. And so when you're looking for examples of how to center Black humanity in a historic space, going to an African-American house and looking at how they tell those stories, how do they even write the exhibit text, listening to the tour guides who are exploring those histories and how they answer questions. That's a really excellent way to do it. Just to get some more examples. Oh, we've got one in Boise, Idaho. Excellent, excellent. Thank you all for sharing those wonderful examples. Langston Hughes House, excellent, excellent, thank you. So I want you to just continue as you're thinking about where are other places that you've been. So one of the first respondents said Monticello. So Monticello is Thomas Jefferson's historic site. Monticello has gone through an amazing transformation, really in the last decade, but especially in the last 5 or 6 years, in the way that they told stories about the African-American experience. So pulling Sally Hemings from the dustbin of history, giving her her own space in the historic house and telling stories that she could be proud of was just, for me, it was an excellent experience. And I'm so excited to one day be able to take my son and the rest of my family to go back there and see all the changes they continue to make. So there's always a lot to do. I know that some of you in the audience are historic house people. Maybe you work or you volunteer in a historic house. I know many of the rest of you are just awesome, dedicated visitors to historic houses. So I'm looking forward to your questions and ideas and thoughts. And also, especially for all of you who are like super fun visitors at historic houses, as you are seeing the changes that are being made at historic houses all around the country, in their tours, in their public programs, and everything that they do, make sure that you're always visiting with a critical eye. There's always something that can be changed. When you think about the iPhone or a smartphone, every time they do an upgrade, you're like, yes, this is perfect. I've got everything that I want. Finally, I didn't even know I needed a better camera than I just got. And then a few days later, you realize, oh, actually, there's still some things wrong. It's the same thing with historic houses. And so make sure that if you are seeing anything that you think can be done or changed or added to a historic house, that you are talking to the staff, because historic houses exist for us, the public. And so it's important to make sure that there's always that back and forth conversation. So if you see there's something that needs to be changed, something can be added, let us know. We always, me as a historic house person working at the National Trust, it's really important that I get that feedback. And that's just on African-American history, but on the interpretation of all histories. So with that, I would love to hear any questions you all have. Please make sure that you put the questions in the Q&A box. I think some of the questions may have ended up in the chat, and that's totally fine. We'll go back and forth. And I would like to welcome Betsy back to the screen, and she's going to facilitate a little Q&A.
Great, thanks, Elon. Yes, we already have questions lined up. So to access the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A icon if you move your mouse down. And if you click that, it will pop up, and I'll read your question out loud so everyone can hear it. So actually, the first one is one I had too, which is that you mentioned a list of words that could help, you know, the sort of right and wrong way, or the more appropriate and more sensitive way, et cetera, of saying things. And we would all love to have that list. If it's something that could be linked to or distributed, we could put a link to it to all the participants.
Sure. There's a workshop that I do on interpreting the racial history of historic sites. And so there's a little workshop, and I can send that to you. I mean, sorry, a worksheet that I can send you that actually has a list of all the different racial categories, and it's organized like how the US Census organizes them. But then each category has all the other words, like all the words that are considered to be synonymous to that particular term. So there's African American, Black, Negro, colored, person of color, BIPOC. It's the full list. And so the idea is that you look through that list and you begin figuring out which of those terms are the most appropriate for certain contexts. And then we talk that through. But yes, I can send you all the worksheet on that.
Okay, great. We can send that out to all the people who signed up for this program. Great. Let's see. This one from Amy Kurtz-Lansing. What are your thoughts on inviting visitors to experience a site as a particular historic personage?
So if my screen had been working properly, you would have seen that I've actually done quite a bit of historic interpretation in historical clothing. And so I think that doing this kind of work, interpreting history in historical clothes, can be an excellent educational opportunity when it's done right, especially by someone who is well trained and experienced and who has done a lot of thorough research into the history, like the historical time period in which that individual lived. And it's key to not only know the history, but how that person's life was impacted by the broader context and how that history connects to what's going on in America right now. So as an example, one of my former jobs as director of the Robbins House, which is an African-American historic house in Concord, Massachusetts. And so I would do presentations dressed as Ellen Garrison Jackson, who was born in the house, and she was born in 1823 or 1833, and she was a freeborn woman living in the North. And she became an educator and a civil rights activist in the era of the Civil War and just after. And so I was able to actually draw direct connections between what she was, the demands she was making in her letters and other sources, to the kinds of demands that were being made by people involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, the civil rights movement, and the abolitionist movement. Oh, and the women's rights movement. I know the ERA has come up a lot in the last couple of years as something we're talking about, the Equal Rights Amendment. So she, especially in 1870 and 80, was actually spending a lot of time talking about and asking for and demanding the types of rights that we in 2018, 1920 are continuing to demand. And so sometimes it's about demanding a particular right to equitable treatment. Other times it's the enforcement of a particular right. And so I was able to dress as Ellen Garrison and speak as though I was back in 1870 and ask questions about, are women fully equal and fully equitably treated in America today? Are Black people equitably treated today? Are Black people harassed by law enforcement in your day and age, especially when they're unarmed? This was something that was going on in Ellen Garrison's time, is something she was talking about. This is something that's going on in our modern era, and something she was talking about. So when you are able to, when someone puts on a historical clothing and is able to bring context to the history and be able to make what's going on in our real lives right now today make sense, then they're doing an excellent job. Some historic sites, there's a couple of really great articles that came out last year about this, but some historic sites continue to dress white women in historical costuming and have them demonstrating tasks that would have been done in the colonial and the antebellum era that would have only been done by enslaved people. And so when that happens, that actually erases the actual history of that particular site, or the history of who was doing that task and how it was done. A lot of this is because it's very difficult for a lot of historic sites to recruit African Americans and other people of color to work, especially in historical costuming, interpreting history. And a lot of that is because people of color there's a long history of people of color feeling excluded and mistreated at historic sites. So there's a whole, unfortunately, there's a long history of negative experiences for people of color when it comes to museums and historic sites that makes it not particularly appealing to want to go put on the costume of an enslaved person and then talk to predominantly white visitors about this history. And for those of us who do that work, it's very challenging on a day-to-day basis, the kinds of questions that we get, comments from the public. A lot of times, especially women who are dressed in historical clothing are touched and groped by members of the public. So there's a lot of challenges for people of color when doing this kind of work. And in my discussions with Indigenous women, especially, who do historical interpretation in costuming in the North, they have a lot of the same negative experiences. So it can be really challenging to recruit people, really challenging to keep people. But when they are properly protected by the historic site, when there are policies in place to make sure that they have what they need to be successful, and when the public is well educated about this history and this information, then we actually have really incredibly impactful educational opportunities.
Thank you. The next question here I have from Howard Czar. He says, you raised important points about how we teach history. You know, Howard?
I do.
Much of the white traditional history is taught as myth and stereotype. How can we ever expect to get Black history right if the way we teach history is in myth and stereotype?
Thank you, Howard. Excellent question. So when it comes, as I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, when you center Black humanity, when you center Asian humanity, when you center Latinx humanity, you're centering everyone's humanity, everyone that individual interacted with. And when it comes to my work with historic houses, a lot of what I'm doing these days, especially, is pushing sites to turn a critical eye on how they interpret white history. Are they actually allowing white Americans and European Americans to be fully realized individuals who had flaws, who made choices that had negative impacts on other people and on themselves? So it's so necessary that when we're centering Black humanity, we have to center everyone at the same time. It involves doing more research, but for the most part, it actually just involves seeing the history that's already been found in a different way. And one way to do that is look for collaborators. With the historic sites I work with, a lot of times I'm talking to them about looking for sensitivity editors, individuals whose job is specifically to look for issues within the text, the exhibit text, or the storytelling done by the tour guides, or the information that's up on the website, everything. So it's a lot of work, but it's really necessary to do. Great question, Howard.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in this source of sensitivity editors. Maybe you could tell us where we can find a list of such people. We could send that out to everyone as well. I'd like to know how to find those.
So unfortunately, I have yet to find a full list of folks who do this. But there are organizations like the Slave Dwelling Project that is, they have a whole list of consultants and historical interpreters that they work with that do a lot of excellent sensitivity editing work. There's also a group on Facebook called the Black Interpreters Guild. It's a group that I organized back in 2016 of African descendant individuals, mainly in the United States, but we also have a whole bunch of folks in the Caribbean, Africa, and Europe, who are museum experts. And so a lot of times if I know a historic site in New York that's looking for a consultant to come in and read through their tour guide text or something like that, then I'll put a message up on the board and then folks will jump in and apply to do it. So there's information out there. There's also the Association of African American Museums. You can always post a little request for proposal through them, and they put it out to their entire list of mostly African American museum professionals. And so that's another way of finding great people to work with your historic site.
This one comes from one of our board members, Susan Ball. And she says, how do you handle the physical absence of so much Black history? For example, the Dubois house where the actual house is gone.
I think you're saying W.E.B. Du Bois house. I think that's it. So whenever there is...
That was probably my fault in pronouncing it wrong. My apologies.
That's okay. No worries. Most people say Dubois. And I think he and a few other people from that family and a few other branches say Du Bois. So it's easy to misunderstand. So when it comes to what to do when a historic house is missing, Old Salem Museum and Gardens in North Carolina has a really great example of what to do. That's actually a collection of historic properties all together. And they recognize that the houses that belong to enslaved people and free Blacks were missing. So they actually put up like skeleton structures of those properties in the spaces where they would have existed. And then put out information, put up exhibit text and waysides that presents information about the individuals who would have lived and worked in those spaces. So that's all. So if there's a building missing, create a building. Or in cases where, a lot of times it's too expensive or it takes too much space to create a building where one used to exist. So putting up historical markers is another way of ensuring that when the public is walking around, they have a full glimpse of the history of a space.
Sometimes that can be very powerful to see a skeleton of something to make you realize what was torn down and what was kept. So that's a message in itself.
There's another house in Philadelphia that I want to say it's called Freedom House, but that might not be right. Where it's a big rebuilt structure. It's mainly like glass panes, and they have all kinds of images and stories about African Americans who I think lived and worked in the White House when it was in Philly. So I mean, there's a lot of really great examples of historic houses or historic places that have reconstructed structures for educational purposes like that. And then you can look around any city to find historical markers. And I mean, there's also always the important work of when you have a historic house, if you know that there was a African-American history in your community, then doing the work of digging through your records, finding the stories that are related to your house, and telling those stories inside your historic site too.
This next one is from Karen Zukowski. She says, it seems like telling Black history is a part of telling the story of the less powerful or powerless. Even acknowledging the dynamics of power is difficult. It seems to threaten the people with power. How do you talk in a productive way?
That is an evergreen question, especially in my work. A lot of times, people in power, and that's in really any industry, any organization, they may have gotten to their position of power and maybe they want to see something else, and maybe they want to change, but change is always hard. I think about how desperately I wanted a baby, and my beautiful son was born, and I was not prepared. Like, I wanted that change in my life to happen, but I was not really as prepared as I thought I was when he was actually born. So change is hard. It's always really important that all of us who recognize changes that need to be made do what Frederick Douglass tells us to do. Agitate, agitate, agitate. You see what is wrong. You learn what needs to be changed, how to change it. You pull together, you do the repair work. You find other people to join you in the effort of making the change. And then you begin pushing the powers that be for that change. A lot of times, with the sites that I work with, you have to work from the inside and the outside. So if you are an individual who works inside a historic home, then you may want to work with an outside organization to help you push for change, to bring attention to the changes that need to be made through social media, or you could bring in a class of students, maybe historic preservation or public humanities students, to do some analysis on that site. A lot of times it's really helpful to have someone outside your organization do kind of do an examination of the site and to identify what needs to be changed. Because a lot of times, especially if you're kind of on the bottom rung of an institution, it might be really difficult for you to make change from the inside all by yourself, especially if the changes you're pushing could put your job in jeopardy. It's really why a lot of institutions don't change. In my last few jobs, when changes needed to be made, I had to think about, okay, if my boss doesn't like this, how am I going to pay my student loans? How am I going to pay my mortgage? How will I pay for any of the things that I need if I push really hard for this change? And it just so happened that I was able to work collaboratively with people outside my organization to make the changes that were necessary. And we were able to make the changes. So it's hard, but it's necessary.
Okay, here's another one from Katie Hastert. I work at the Thomas Hart Benton Home and Studio. And in 1835, he participated in an exhibition put on by the NAACP about lynching. They were all visual artists in the art, and the art produced for the show was understandably graphic and disturbing. I think it's a really important exhibition considering the time, and would like to maybe have a small exhibit at the house for Black History Month next year. I'm finding it challenging to find a way to present it. Would you have any suggestions?
Whew. So I actually did a study guide and a series of public programs on based around a book on the history of lynching in the United States. And so I feel you, it is incredibly difficult work to do, mainly because of the content. When it comes to displaying images of Black death, or death in any form, it's always incredibly important to be sensitive to not only the reactions of viewers, but also be thinking seriously about how would, in this case, the murdered person want to be displayed to the world. When you think about it, a lynching victim, when that image is snapped of their body hanging, that is the most terrifying, horrific moment in that individual's life before they die. In many cases, people's clothes were stripped, their bodies were badly beaten. I mean, it's horrific. Would that individual want their body seen? Would they want for the people coming to the museum that to be the only thing that is known about that individual? I don't know. It's not what I would want. It's incredibly important if you're going to do an exhibition on lynching that you pull in support from the Black community. So that could be working with an NAACP group. It could be working with the Black Lives Matter group. It could be working with members of Black churches or other organizations and institutions, the Black sororities and fraternities. But it's important for you to get groups of Black people to participate in the creation of that exhibit. So that could be you put together the exhibit proposal, you take it to an outside group, and you say, what do you think of the project that we're doing? Would you support this? Is there anything that you would change about the way we're talking about this history or displaying these images? And then they can let you know. Either way. The reason why it's so incredibly important to get these kind of collaborators as part of the process before the final product is created is that they will be your sensitivity editors. They will see if there is a problem. And when everything is said and done and the exhibit comes out, the public programs, whatever it is, happens, if there's any kind of backlash, then you've got a group of supporters who can say, we actually thought this was a great educational opportunity. We thought this was done sensitively, thoughtfully, and with grace. So it's so necessary to get this group to be supportive of the project and to make sure that during the process that you are doing this in a way that's respectful and correct. And that's even when it's a Black person leading the project. When I was doing the programs on lynching, I ran what I was doing by other Black people in the community. And it's always good to find someone who you know is going to be critical. And you ask them, what do you think of this? And then when they respond, then you know you're getting the best information, the most accurate information about what you can change, how you can improve, and what your next steps are. So definitely get your outside collaborators, no matter what.
That's great advice. This one from Alan Wallach is a Thomas Cole scholar and a great helper to our site. We live in a society in which, alas, systemic racism is very much alive and well. How should docents, curators, and other historic house personnel deal with visitors who make accusations of political correctness or behave toward historical reenactors, as sometimes happened at Colonial Williamsburg, as if they were actually enslaved people? So yeah, in other words, dealing with visitors.
You have to, number one, love people. Everybody who works at a historic house, especially frontline workers, you must love humanity in all its faults. Otherwise, you cannot make it through the day. I have several friends who used to work for, and a couple who still work for Colonial Williamsburg, colleagues at a variety of different historic institutions that do first-person interpretation in historical clothing, or also folks who do interpretation, which is what I usually did, what I did for the most part, which is in regular street clothes, or polos, branded polos. It's always really important for historic sites to look at their policies and think about, how are we protecting our staff from the public? A lot of times, historic houses in any institution organization, you look at the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You look at their laws that are probably up in a workspace somewhere in the building that say that discrimination is allowed and harassment's not allowed. But none of that covers our interactions with the public. So a lot of it is you have to think about, am I as a executive director at a historic house, am I allowing my one Indigenous female interpreter in her historical clothing to be alone in a big historic space with maybe only one or two visitors? That's usually when problems happen. So thinking about, what are the key safety policies that need to be in place to make sure that physical safety is at minimum maintained. On top of that, when it comes to emotional and intellectual safety that all frontline people need, a lot of that has to do with training. So that's getting training on how to facilitate dialogues with the public on challenging topics. There's a bunch of different groups that run workshops on that. I run workshops on that. It's to give the staff the opportunity to use new terms that maybe they aren't comfortable with. So do I use Black? Do I use African American? One of the jokes that a lot of Black interpreters that we have is the fact that, when a white interpreter is speaking to, just a big group of visitors, and there's like one Black person in the tour, when the interpreter gets to the part of the story about African American history or about slavery, they turn to that one Black person in the tour, and they basically tell the whole thing to that Black person. Everyone needs to know the story, but it's a habit that a lot of interpreters have, is that they think, well, I got to tell the Black stuff to the Black person, or I don't know what word I use in my normal world. I don't talk about race. I don't see color. So I don't have any practice using racial terminology. So when I get to the point in the story where I have to talk about an African descendant, I stumble on Black African American. It's something that happens all the time when I'm a visitor at historic houses. It's like a little annoying thing that happens. And it's really all about practice. You just have to have practice using the terms, talking about challenging topics. You need to know what the core myths are to African American history, and you need to know how to be able to dismantle those myths. Because people come to your historic site full of information. It's not all correct. And so when they walk up to a tour guide and they hear information that is contradictory to what they learned in school or from their uncle or at a different historic site, the tour guide has to be prepared to deal with that contradiction that happens. So it's getting some training, getting some practice, and making sure that there's always opportunities for professional development and education at the historic site.
Now, I just want to say to the audience, we're going past where we usually do, because I think there's a great thirst for this information and question and answer session. So I'm going to let it go on a little longer, if that's all right with you, Elon.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because this has been, I think, really fascinating for everyone. This next question is from Amy Huffnagel, who works at our sister historic site, Olana, across the river. Thank you, Elon. Great talk. Teaching Tolerance, Learning for Justice, has been talking about, quote, teaching whiteness. Can you unpack this term a bit and maybe expand on the role it plays in teaching a Black history perspective?
Sure. So the issue of teaching whiteness, that's something I was talking just a little bit about earlier, is actually seeing the category of whiteness as a racial category. For the vast majority of us, we were taught that whiteness is the default. That it doesn't need to be mentioned. When you look at old newspapers as an example, or when you go to an archive, especially Southern archives, Black information or information about Black people is categorized, it's termed, it's labeled, it's right there. John, a Black man walked down the street. Meanwhile, Tom, a white guy, is just Tom walked down the street. So it's really key to make sure that you are actually seeing whiteness. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to say, Tom, a white guy, walked down the street. It just means that you make it equitable. It's also really important to be thinking about, especially with historic houses that are dedicated to the life of a white American or European American. It's really, really key to make sure that you are thinking critically about fully who that individual was. So I guess if you've got an individual who's living during the Enlightenment in New England, then actually understanding how the Enlightenment intersected with racial ideologies in this country during that time. So there were a lot of Enlightenment thinkers that had very racist ideas about the world, and that influenced the stories that they told, that influenced their theorizing that they did. And so if you have individuals, especially white individuals, who are living in America during the Enlightenment time period, then you want to be making sure that if someone says that they are an abolitionist, as an example, is that someone who believes in abolition, but they want all free Black people to go to Africa? Because most white abolitionists believed that America should be a white country. And so once Black people are free, they have to go somewhere, but not here. They either need to go, you know, out to California, which wasn't part of the country yet. They need to go all the way out there and establish a Black colony there. Or they need to go to Africa, or they need to go to the Caribbean. A lot of folks were sent down to Jamaica and Haiti. So it's thinking about, you know, if you're saying if you're talking about a white abolitionist, what's their full understanding of abolition? What did they really think? Do they think Black people can stay here? That they could be, if they could stay here, great. Can they marry your daughter? Can they sit next to you in church? Can they sit on the train with you? So it's a lot of times when we tell stories about white Americans, we're very seriously focused on their interactions with other white people. So with George Washington, we talk about George Washington and his interactions with Thomas Jefferson. But when we talk about George Washington's interactions with the enslaved people, it's done in a way that privileges George Washington's perspective. So it's George Washington directed his slaves to build Mount Vernon. It's not enslaved people who were skilled and had skilled and experience creating architectural marvels were able to build Mount Vernon. So it's thinking, a lot of this is really thinking about how are we seeing whiteness? How are we talking about it? And are we making sure that white individuals, that we're talking about everything that they knew, everything that they learned, how they interacted with people. So if they had an interaction with a person of color, what was that interaction like? So it's just really continuing to fill in the gaps, not just with Black history, but with all histories.
This next question is something that came up also in conversations at the Thomas Cole site is kind of what do you do when you don't feel like you have enough evidence there? So this one says that you mentioned some narratives that can provide context for the lives of enslaved people. So you mentioned Harriet Jacobs, for example. With the physical archive being notorious for Black erasure and narrative manipulation, do you find that you have leaned into non-tangible forms of knowledge in providing context at historic houses? And if so, what has that looked like in your experience? I think the question that came up at our site was, we don't want to feel like we're making stuff up or putting words in people's mouths that we couldn't find. You know, with Thomas Cole, every single one of his letters, you know, was saved, so we can quote him directly. But we don't have letters from the other people in the house. So we didn't want to put words in their mouth. So can you comment on that issue?
So one of the myths of history is that we are telling the full story, that history is set, it's done, it's there in the primary sources, that's it. The reality is history in a lot of ways is make-believe. For everyone, we are filling in the gaps. We are pulling strings together and trying to tie it up neatly into a bow so that it makes sense for the public to understand. So even highly documented people, we still have to do a lot of work of pulling that information together in order to tell a relatable story. So, I mean, I would argue that it's more work a lot of times when you are interpreting the histories of people of color and also white women in our history, because they are not as heavily documented, but there is still a lot of filling in the gaps work that must be done for everyone, really. Did that answer the question?
I like that answer a lot. Okay. I'm going to give that next time it comes up. Okay, let's see. This one is about another board member of ours. What are your ideas? That's from Hudson Talbot. what are your ideas for reaching out and engaging the local community of color? So in Catskill, for example, there is quite a diverse community, but not a lot of contact between communities. So how do we start to change that?
So, I mean, there are many strategies for doing that. A lot of it is Googling it. Whenever I start a new position or I start working on a new project with a new historic house, that's really a lot of what I'm doing. Is I'm trying to figure out where is the local African Methodist Episcopal Church. I know there's going to be some Black folks there that perhaps I could reach out to and work with. Where is the local Delta Sigma Theta organization, sorority, that I could reach out to? Where are the schools? What public and private schools have Black students? The local colleges and universities. Does a local college or university have an Africana or African American or Black Studies department? So there's a lot of different places you can find people. Sometimes it might be people who are only there temporarily, like students. Other times it's people who have been living there for generations. And it's not just about finding people in your 10-mile square radius. A lot of times you may have to actually reach out. So with the Robbins House, as an example, in Concord, Massachusetts. Concord, Massachusetts is 98% white, and that's when you include the prison. When you don't include the prison, it's like 99.8% white. There are basically 2 Black families in the community and a handful of other African American individuals. But there's an African American historic house there. When you look at the board, it's fairly racially balanced. When it comes to Black and white individuals, they always have frontline interpretive staff who are African American and other people of color. When you look at the events, you can go on the Robbins House's website, you can look at pictures from the various public programs that they've had. There are always people of color in those photos. And it's not because we took the camera, ran around and found like the one Black family and we just took a bunch of pictures of them, which I see a lot of organizations do. It's not that, it's different people. And it's because we worked really hard to reach out to the Black community, not just in our local community, but all the surrounding communities, and to have not just a very local presence, but a statewide and actually national presence. And so through that work, when there were Black people coming and visiting Concord because they wanted to go see the place where the shot heard around the world happened and started the Revolutionary War, people had heard, wait, there's a Black historic house here. Where is it? Where is it? And they would go find it. So, I mean, a lot of what has to be done is, getting the right keywords up on your website so that when people are searching for Black history, that they know that they can also come to this particular historic house. It's doing the active reaching out to people of color in the surrounding community and other communities. It may also mean pulling someone in on your board who is from outside the state. And especially, this pandemic world has meant that basically everyone who has had to learn how to Zoom. So that means you can get someone living in South Africa on your board. If they're willing to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and talk, there you go. So the pandemic has meant we can't be in each other's physical presence, but it has also actually helped bring down some barriers to participation, to visitation, to employment. So, I think a lot of this is just doing some research, looking around, and trying to turn barriers into opportunities.
All right, I think this will be our last question. If you still have voice left in your in your voice box.
Have some water.
Thank you for sticking with us. Okay. This anonymous attendee says, it brings up the question of when a historic site's mission is to talk about the vision or a writer or an artist, then how do you also tell the story of everyone else who lived there? So, for example, in a 1-hour tour, you're limited to how much you can say. If the mission is not to share a historic moment in time, but the vision of a creative person, how can it be done without losing the story we want to tell or without feeling like it's a reach?
Sure. I mean, this is where you're telling the full humanity of that individual, really. No man is an island, you know, that old adage. So no artist, especially, existed completely alone without any help from anyone. The vast majority of artists in our country have had some kind of, you know, financial economic struggle, or were able to do the work that they did because other people, you know, cleaned their homes, cooked their meals, cared for their children, you know, cared for their homes and their properties, and did the work of supporting their work as artists. One of my favorite historic house examples on this is actually, oh my gosh, what's his name? Oh, shoot. Well, there's a historic house, sorry, the historic house in Providence, Rhode Island, that was for a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And one of the things I really love that they do is that when they are telling his story, especially at the end of the tour, they talk about all the people who supported his work. They recognize that the fact that he was only able to spend the intellectual time sitting and thinking and coming up with the broad vision for our country that he did because enslaved women did all the food shopping. They mended his clothes. They cared for his children. They cared for his wife when she was sick. They did all of they did a lot of the support work, and what they did not do was done by his wife and his children. They did the work that that funded his lifestyle. So, I mean, no one lives completely on their own. There might be that one artist who lived in the woods their entire life and then died without anyone knowing what they did until somebody discovered a buried cache of their stuff. Sure, fine, there's that guy. But most of us have a lot of people surrounding us who support our work. I've got my husband taking care of my baby. I've got my dad taking care of my mom who just had hip surgery. Like there's all kinds of supporters who are doing what they need to do to make sure I can sit here in front of this screen unbothered by anyone and focus on this conversation. So it's everyone being fully human in history and right now.
I think that's the perfect way to conclude this program. Thank you so tremendously much for your time and amazing insights today, Elon. And thank you everyone else. I would also like to thank all the people that made this possible. We are dedicating our 2021 Sunday Salons to the memory of our longtime supporter, David Gray, who supported this series. And other support for this series is provided by Humanities New York Action Grant with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the New York State Council on the Arts with support of Governor Andrew M. Cuomo and the New York State Legislature, Empire State Development's I Love New York program under the Market New York initiative, and a special thank you to the Kindred Spirit Society of the Thomas Cole National Historic Site who support all our work. So with that, I will say goodbye. Everyone enjoy the snowy day, and thanks again, Elon, for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a great Sunday.